Great. Okay. Welcome everyone. My name is Naisheen. I am one of the co-executive directors at House Our Neighbors. We ran the I-135 and Prop 1A initiative that just completed in February. Really excited to bring some amazing panelists. We have Fernando from Seattle DSA and the Raise the Wage Renton campaigns, Katie Wilson from Transit Writers Union. Their organization led the Tukwila and Burien minimum wage campaigns. Mary from Washington Can, who led the Federal Way Stable Homes Initiative, and then my colleague Tiffany McCoy, our other co-ED of House Our Neighbors, working on the social housing campaigns. And what's wonderful is, most of us here have helped with each other's initiatives, and there's a lot of crossover, particularly for ours, DSA and Washington Can were a huge part of I-135 and Prop 1A. So really great to have everyone here together. So let me just start. We'll hear more from our panelists much more later. But the reason we're holding this event are, we believe initiatives are a powerful tool for making direct change in our communities. We're seeing it being used more and more. Right now, particularly right now, our federal and our state governments are only disinvesting in services and programs that serve people. And for many of us, we can't rely on our local elected officials either to create the systems we need. So, really a good opportunity for people to take things into their own hands. However, the initiative processes is also complex and confusing. So we want to just, share this knowledge as much as we can in 90 minutes, provide a realistic picture of what it looks like to run and win initiatives. And of course, with the limited time, it'll be more high level today. There's a lot of detail, but we'll share some resources that can help you find more details. And at least from the House Our Neighbors standpoint, we're happy to serve as a further resource as well. Just a quick note, thank you to our sponsors. We have 2 sponsors for this event. We're also doing an in-person event on Tuesday, Social Justice Fund Northwest and Communities of Opportunity. Both are organizations deeply invested in grassroots efforts for systemic change, and just really grateful to them for supporting this. All right, so our high-level agenda is just, we'll do some overview background about initiatives and the process. We'll have a panel discussion, about 45 minutes, Q&A. Feel free to, as you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We'll probably wait till the Q&A to answer them, but we can go back up and look at them or hold them. This last one is just for the in-person event where we'll have some, open conversation time at the end. Okay, so what is the power of initiative? It is the authority of the voters of a municipality to directly initiate and enact legislation through putting it on the ballot. State initiatives are also possible. That's not our focus today. Everyone here has worked on, local kind of city level initiatives. What municipalities have the power of initiative available? This one's, a little more complicated. There's, a class called first class cities that automatically are able to have initiatives. Code cities have to adopt the powers of initiative. And then there are charter counties. I'm going to link, I'm going to put in the chat one of the guides that we'll share later as well. Why is it not? There we go. This PDF, if you go down, scroll down to Appendix A, it has the whole list of cities and counties that can run initiatives. So that's a great resource. And then what types of legislation are subject to the initiative process? I'm not an expert on this. I kind of just pulled this. So this would require more digging, possibly with a lawyer, but the legislation must be both legislative in nature, so versus what they call administrative, and then not a power that's already granted to a city or county council. And then there may be other limitations depending on the type of municipality. So that's just something you would have to look into for the particular situation. Process. So these are kind of the main steps. There's a lot of detail in between. these should apply. I'll call out when it doesn't apply to everyone, but should be generally applicable to all cities. So first, find your local initiative resource, understand what applies to you and where you are. You draft a petition, so you draft the legislation that people will be voting on. Except for code cities, you would file the petition with your city or county. Then you gather signatures. The signature gathering requirement, again, will differ based on municipality. It's generally like a percentage of the total registered voters or the total amount of votes cast in a preceding election. Once you believe you have the signatures you submit those. They are validated by the elections office, counted. If there are sufficient signatures, then that gets passed to the county council or commission for action, and they can take one of three actions. So one, they could pass the legislation just on their own, and then it's enacted. Two, they can place it on the ballot as is, or three, they can place it on the ballot with an alternative competing measure. And this is what we faced in our most recent election with Prop 1A. Then, as a campaign, you kind of have your get out the vote process, voter outreach. Oh, good call outs, Katie. So it's in code cities, they cannot place a competing measure on the ballot. Thank you for that. And we can edit the slides as well. Then get out the vote, voter outreach, door knocking, canvassing, all the activities we'll talk about later. Then there's an election. I believe, anyone correct me if I'm wrong, but it's either they can place it on the November election, February, or April, I believe are the options. And then if it passes, then you move on to implementation. And also there are potential, legal defense. There are, a number of folks here who have dealt with lawsuits to their initiative after passage. All right, and then just a few notes on compliance and fundraising. So, there's a lot of detailed rules around how you can raise money and just reporting and compliance. I would recommend hiring, or if you're lucky enough to have someone on staff familiar with the state and local reporting requirements, great. Otherwise, you need to hire a campaign treasurer familiar with these regulations. You need to register as a political committee with the State Public Disclosure Commission before you start fundraising. You may also need to register locally if needed. And just know, what is generally required in advance. We also had a lawyer who we could turn to for questions that we weren't sure about. The nice thing is that there are no fundraising caps for initiatives. So unlike with candidates where there is a limit of what people can contribute, there isn't for initiatives. There are, if you're an organization that is contributing money to a PAC, you'll want to understand those considerations. There are thresholds over which you may have to do more reporting or register. So as an organization, you'll want to look more into that. And then there are some more resources here. We will send out a copy of these slides afterwards, everyone who's registered, so that you're able to get these links. This is just, so there's the MRSC guide that I already linked earlier. And then there's just an example of a city initiative petition guide. This is for Seattle, but hopefully each city kind of has their own specific guides, and then a FAQ page to the Public Disclosure Commission. All right, let's move on to our panel. I'm going to stop sharing so you can see everyone. Let's see if I can pin. Okay, did I do that right? Are you seeing 5 panels? Okay, so let me pull up. All right, so we will move on to questions in a minute, but I just want to have each panelist introduce themselves, give a brief overview of the initiative or initiatives they work on. When was it? Why did you decide to go the initiative route, etc. I'm also going to share in the chat right here a just like a at a glance table just with basic information about each campaign so you can refer back because I know there's a lot of campaigns going on right in this room. And so I'm putting this link. I hope you can access it. Just some basic information about each campaign to serve as a resource. Okay, let's get started with Fernando.
Hi, y'all. Yeah, I'm Fernando. I'm a member of Seattle DSA. Have been involved in, I think, 5 out of 6 of these campaigns. I'm sorry I couldn't make it out to Federal Way, but mostly with Raise the Wage Renton, did a lot of organizing and signature gathering for that campaign to help us copy the legislation that TRU had put forward in other cities that I think we all copied from CTAC and make sure we got higher wages for folks in Renton. Yeah, I'm happy to answer lots of questions about how that campaign went and looking forward to getting to know folks here.
Thanks, Fernando. Katie.
Yeah, hi everyone. Katie Wilson with the Transit Riders Union. So yeah, back in 2022, we launched the ballot initiative campaign in Tukwila to raise the minimum wage up to match it, the wage next door in SeaTac roughly. And then this year, last year and this year, we ran an initiative in Burien to also raise the minimum wage. Naisheen, did you want us to go into any more detail at this point about like why we chose an initiative versus anything else, or are we
Yeah,
just
just
keeping it
just
quick?
if there's a little bit of info, if you considered other routes to, pass
Sure.
through.
So yeah, I mean, in Tukwila, we set out to do a ballot initiative partly because we wanted to use it for organizing. We didn't just want to get legislation passed. So we actually wanted to get out and knock on thousands of doors and talk to thousands of voters. And also just, we were inspired by the work that Washington Can had done in Federal Way, which you'll also hear about. And we wanted to get the experience of running a ballot initiative. And, Tukwila, we chose Tukwila partly because it's a very small city in terms of its residential population. And so, TRU as a very grassroots small organization, we felt like we could handle the number of signatures that we had to gather there. But at the same time, it's a huge job center with South Centre Mall and lots of retail around there. And so in terms of the impact of the policy for the work that we had to do, it was a big kind of like bang for your buck. So that's partly why we chose Tukwila. Also, we were able to get there by public transit from Seattle, and a lot of our members are, transit riders who don't have cars, so that was actually a significant consideration. So yeah, so that was Tukwila, and then in Burien, we actually tried to go through the city council first, and so we spent a lot of time in 2023 pushing their city council to pass minimum wage legislation similar to Tukwila. But then the Burien Council turned out to be worse than we thought. And then there were elections in 2023 in November that made them even worse. And so they ended up like they were scared that we would do a ballot initiative. And so they passed like kind of fake minimum wage legislation. They kind of pretended to raise the minimum wage, but had so many like loopholes and carve outs that almost no one was going to actually get a raise. And the ironic thing is that if they hadn't passed anything, we probably would have just been like, oh, okay, well, we'll wait till there's a better council. But because they passed this bad legislation, we couldn't let a bad precedent be set. And so they kind of forced our hand. And we're like, okay, I guess we have to do a ballot initiative, even though we didn't really want to. So that was kind of how we ended up doing it in Burien. And, Washington Can big time did a ton of the signature gathering, and it was a slog, and we ended up on the February ballot instead of the November one that we wanted to. So that one was less by choice, but and I will get in more later into all the crap that happened. But anyway, yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you for that background. Yeah, it's the situations can be really different in each city, and so thanks for that clarification. All right, Mary.
Hi all, thanks for having me. Mary, she, her with Washington Can. We in 2019, which feels like a lifetime ago, I like really want to quote having to like walk miles and miles and that milk was 30 cents at the time. Like that's how long ago it felt. Um, but we actually had started, this was for just cause eviction in the city of Federal Way. And we actually started with a wanting to have an inspection program and working with the city council almost for 11 months in 2018. And we had prepped all of our members to, when they were going to vote to pass it, we had prepped them to all say thank you, to be really appreciative of the process. And at that city council hearing, landlords were able to disrupt and plea with the city council to include them in the process. And so they had agreed to delay it for another year. And so literally as our members are testifying, how dare you make us wait? You wouldn't let your pets live in the conditions that we live in. Um, sharing their disappointment, our political director at the time, Sochi, was looking up how many signatures do you need to gather while we're at the hearing, and included that in her testimony. So we did want to go the city council route and recognizing that we knock on plenty of doors, that we had named that we were going to run our own initiative and that we wouldn't have to um, negotiate or talk with landlords, and that if they weren't going to do their job, we would do it for them and we would do it better. Back to you, Machine.
Thanks, Mary. And then last but not least, Tiffany.
Good morning, everyone. Tiffany McCoy, she, her pronouns with How's Our Neighbors. In 2022, we started drafting Initiative 135 to create a social housing developer here in the city of Seattle. As most of you know, we intended to do this all in one go. We wanted to fund it and create the structure, but we soon realized that you couldn't fund and create a structure in one initiative. So we always set out for a two-part ballot initiative process. So Initiative 135 passed in a February special election by a 14-point margin. We never intended to go on the February ballot, but once, as we'll get into later, once the process pushed us back to February, we were all ready to go forward because we knew that voters and we knew that renters were desperate for more housing solutions in the city of Seattle. And, most folks at that time were not running any initiatives in a special election. That was kind of counter to popular wisdom. But I think that we've just shown that if you give people something that will make a fundamental material difference in their life, they'll turn out for you at the ballot. So we passed that. The Seattle Social Housing Developer is up and running. And then in 2024, right after the board was set, we started drafting Initiative 137 to progressively tax the wealthiest businesses in the city of Seattle to fund the social housing developer. Initiative 137 became Proposition 1A, which we will discuss later because the council decided to put a competing initiative on, which took away our number and created, this kind of bland, sterile Prop 1A campaign, but we still won that by a 27-point margin. And I agree also with Katie, the reason that we did this through the initiative process, it was never a question. We wanted it to be an organizing opportunity. And we also, because this was just after Harrell had won the mayoral race, this was after Ann Davison won the city attorney race, Sarah Nelson took over in the citywide position. We wanted to be able to also offer an opportunity for folks on the left to plug in an organizing space that was hopeful to them, as opposed to always defending, the scraps that were given by the legislative bodies.
Tiffany. All right, so we'll get into our specific questions right now. We kind of just went from the top of the process of the beginning of an initiative and chronologically through time. For those who join later, you're welcome to throw questions in the chat. We'll do a Q&A after this so we can come back to those, but please feel free to do that as you think of them. All right, so we'll start with just the drafting process of the legislation. I'm going to go to Katie first to talk about, how long did it take for you to draft that initiative? I think you were the first one the first minimum wage, probably it helped set up the others, but you did it the first time. And then, who did you engage in that process? Any notable, events within that process?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we did quite a lot of kind of coalition building and prep before doing the TICLA initiative. We spent probably about 6 months of 2021, like we did a lot of outreach to workers at South Center Mall. We had like a short survey, and we'd go and like talk to people on the job and try to get them to fill out a little survey. And because originally we were like, do we want to include like secure scheduling? We weren't entirely sure what we wanted in the initiative. And so yeah, we interviewed I think around 100 workers. And then we did a ton of like building kind of a coalition with lots of community organizations and labor unions that have members in Tukwila or are based in Tukwila, faith communities, especially like immigrant organizations, and did a lot of talking with them about like what their constituents or members in Tukwila need. I did some small business outreach. So we did a lot of kind of like that groundwork. And then we ended up, just based on everything that we heard from everyone, we decided to keep it relatively simple. So basically raise the minimum wage to match CTAC, although we have kind of I don't want to get too in the weeds, but like the inflation adjustment was more similar to the way Seattle does its inflation adjustment for the minimum wage. And the effect of that was that Tukwila actually isn't exactly like CTAC and now is on its own trajectory and is higher than both Seattle and CTAC. So we decided to raise the minimum wage. And then there is another policy in that initiative called access to hours, which basically says that employers are supposed to offer available work hours to existing part-time employees before hiring new employees. So the idea is to basically give people access to something more like full-time work if they want it. And so we, and the legislation, we worked with Noel Lowney, who's the attorney who's very experienced in initiative law, and drew some from CTAC, Seattle's minimum wage. Just he kind of wrote it based on the laws in other cities. But there's kind of a specific ways that you write an initiative, which are like kind of different from how a council would do it. So it is important to have someone who kind of is experienced in doing this stuff, helping you out on the legal side, I would say. So that was kind of, and I mean, the actual writing of the initiative, it was probably a couple months or so that, we were going back and forth with our attorney about that. And yeah, that's pretty much that. And then, yeah, Burien was pretty much just like more or less copying with a few tweaks, like Tukwila, and I know Renton as well had, kind of copied Tukwila with a few tweaks. So yeah.
Can I just ask, did anyone not use an attorney here for drafting? Okay. And I wonder if Tiffany, you can also talk about the process, maybe for I-135, how it all got started, who you engaged, and also a little bit about the governance structure you set up, with steering committee and just how people got involved.
Yeah, we had, like Katie's campaign, been organizing for a while, but we were actually organizing in opposition to a charter amendment, Charter Amendment 29, which was, ironically dubbed Compassion Seattle, that would have enshrined encampment sweeps as a cornerstone of our homelessness policy in the city of Seattle. And so a group of us got together because we were opposed to that. I was working at Real Change at the time. Washington Can was actually one of the first big organizations that wanted to ally with us, endorsed us, provided staff time. There was a lot of opposition, even in quote unquote progressive circles, about taking the position we were at that time. But just saying that, we went off of a victory of defeating an initiative, and then we wanted to go on the offensive. We wanted to provide a vision of what could actually fundamentally address the housing and the homelessness crisis, as opposed to just punitive criminalization of our unhoused neighbors. So we drafted the initiative probably over 5 months. It was a huge community input process. We had a lot of students actually from UW that got involved in our work group, and we divvied up social housing agencies around the international arena, and then each individual group would come back on Finland, Singapore, Vienna, New Zealand, etc. And then we would decide what was permissible to be in the initiative here in the city of Seattle through our lawyer, who was also Noel Lowney, and then also deciding what could we add in addition to what they have internationally. So such as restorative justice before any eviction proceeding takes place, or making sure that our undocumented neighbors are able to live in this housing. They're right now actually prohibited from a lot of federal funding. That's probably only going to get worse now. But these are ways that in the community input process, we were able to add more to the structure of the social housing developer than if we just did it like internally in isolation. For both Initiative 137 and 135, we both did a community input process. So we drafted, we held listening sessions, and then we made alterations to that before we went and filed it with the Seattle City Clerk. The same for Initiative 137. We figured out what progressive revenue source we could use to fund the social housing developer. We did not want another property tax. We did not want another sales tax. We didn't want another tax that is overwhelmingly felt by poor and working neighbors. So that's where we came up with the excess compensation payroll tax. We did that initiative through actually Dimitri Iglitsin's law firm. And I would say that took about 5 months as well, just drafting that initiative and making sure that it was directly attached to the social housing developer. We wanted to make sure that the city of Seattle didn't have wiggle room to take some of the money that was specifically allocated for the social housing developer. And yeah, the entire time for both of those campaigns, we've been operating through a steering committee structure. Seattle DSA has a seat on that steering committee. Washington Can has a seat on that steering committee as well. But that steering committee has virtually been the same since the No on Charter Amendment 29 campaign. So you build up a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of skills, a level of accountability, and just an ability to be incredibly effective as a group, even if you are, outside of the traditional structures of power.
And just building that base too, it sounds like for both of these campaigns, really important that you were just engaging people on what they wanted right from the get-go and creating opportunities to get involved. Does anyone else have anything they want to say about, building coalitions or drafting the initiative before we move on from this? Feel free to, I know everyone has done it differently, so just chime in whenever.
I think one small thing that I'd add is that one thing I appreciated from everybody's campaigns that I've worked with anyway has been not just the effort on focusing just on the campaign, but thinking about what it's going to look like as you're building organizations post the campaign. So I know that we as Seattle DSA have had a lot of people join, seeing us work with the House Our Neighbors Coalition and everybody. And I imagine TRU has seen similar things from both the campaigns they've worked on, from Prop 1A, from I-135. And I think that working with partners who really emphasize that like ongoing growth of building movements, I think is important, because otherwise we wouldn't see these initiatives continue to flourish. We'd have a boom and bust cycle where we'd have something try and run, maybe it would or wouldn't win, and then either way we wouldn't keep those volunteers and keep that energy behind us going forward. And I think having everybody really willing to emphasize like joining some coalition. Obviously, selfishly, I'll try and get people to join DSA, but I don't really mind if somebody loves TRU more because we collaborate so much, so that it's really just helping all of us in the long run.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, let's move on to signature gathering, which is a huge part, and really resource intensive part of initiatives. So Fernando, let's just continue with you. Love to hear about your strategy going into signature gathering and whether you had to adjust it as time went on.
Yeah, definitely. So we started, to give some context in Renton, you need about 15% of the registered voters in your area that you're running your initiative in a code city. So for us, that was around 9,000 valid signatures. And when you're trying to aim for that many, you have to go higher. So if you need around 9,000, really you need around 12,000 to try and get to the 9,000. So we started doing some similar strategies to what we would see from other campaigns in Seattle and elsewhere, where we would do tabling events. We would do kind of high foot traffic areas around locations like shopping malls. So we were at the Renton Landing quite a bit, around Target, around all all the other shops there. We would be at libraries, we'd be at grocery stores. So we did that quite a bit. But Renton had kind of a more unique geography than, like more challenging geography than I would say in Seattle, because it's surrounded by other municipalities, it's surrounded by Seattle, it's surrounded by Tukwila, Newcastle, unincorporated King County. And unfortunately, none of those people count when you want to count a validated signature. So we realized probably several months into our process, as we were starting to evaluate signatures ourselves and see like what our validity was looking like, that we had more invalid signatures than we were banking on. So our rates were probably at that point closer to 55% validity than what we'd hope to see in somewhere like Seattle, which was closer to like 65 to 70% validity, because there's just so many more Seattleites. And so we started to realize that we had to change up our strategy a little bit. And towards the later stages of the campaign, as we were doing initial submissions, we did one submission, we didn't succeed, and then we resubmitted at a later time. And part of the big changes that happened in between those two were making sure we had really high quality signatures by doing door knocking in neighborhoods where we would literally go door to door collecting signatures that we knew would be high quality. And we got, I think, upwards of like 90% validity on a lot of those signatures towards the end, because we were trying to be so diligent about that. Ultimately, you have to do the math on kind of like what your percentage validity times the number of signatures that you're getting. And it worked out close to the same or a little bit better when we did doors towards the end. So that definitely changed. And then the other piece, I think, is at the very beginning of our campaign, we did essentially exclusively volunteer collection for a pretty large portion of our campaign. For Renton signatures, I believe the numbers that I remember were something around 65% of our signatures were gathered unpaid, just volunteer time and labor. And then towards the end of our campaign, we started investing more in paid gathering to make sure we could close the gap that we needed to close in order to get on the ballot. And so we, for the most part, retained just like people individually. We didn't end up going to too many outside firms because we were on a pretty tight budget, and we needed to coordinate as much as we could with like people that we knew who were willing to put in the hours for the prices that we could we could offer them, which weren't amazing, but obviously were above the minimum wage that we were trying to win. And eventually that did all end up coming together, and we submitted a second time and got our valid signatures to get on the ballot. So definitely having to adjust to both the geography and the campaign that you're running to see what the best strategies are, and kind of learning as you go from continuing to evaluate like what your rates are, being able to do voter checks against the voter files of your signatures to see if they're still good or if there's things you can improve on depending on the location and things like that. So yeah.
There you go. I'm gonna Mary, because I know your model's a little different where you have a lot of staff doing this. So I'd love to hear how you all approach signature gathering, how you staff that, and yeah, anything notable about your process.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a ton of overlap to what Fernando said too. But I would say that, Washington has had a canvas for over 40 years, a paid canvas, and we really came out of the birth of, really wanting to professionalize canvassing and knocking on the door, and that like this is a hard skill set. Like it is, these are skill sets that you can take to lots of different entities. And jobs. So I'll start off by saying that we also started at the sites and Federal Way. Like, of course, let's go where people are shopping once a week. Let's go to these heavily trafficked areas. And Federal Way is a hub for shopping. So many people that did not live in Federal Way were shopping at these stores. And so when we began with these big sites and started validating signatures, we saw that it was a very low turnout or low voter validation rate. And so we did two things. One is we trained our canvassers to do more heavily vetting at the time of signature gathering. So they asked a minimum of 3 times different ways of, are you a registered voter in Federal Way? Have you received your ballot at the house that you live at in Federal Way? And great, when is the last time you remember seeing this ballot? Like that's the level that we had to do. And at times people were like, do you want us to sign this or not? But I think you have to be that diligent, because once we were that diligent, it increased the validation rate. And that became heavily saturated after about 4 to 6 weeks, where literally people would wave, yeah, we did that 3 weeks. Yep, we did that last week. Like before we even said hello. So we actually ended up having to move to the doors and we went door to door. And that increased the validation rate quite a bit. Our goal was to gather about 9,900 signatures, and we were able, and we turned in about 7,900 that were valid signatures. So I would say that, that's super labor intensive, and we want to go to people where they're at. It guaranteed a higher validity rate when we went to them where they were at. And we could then actually say, great, where is your voter ballot? Did you see it on the counter? To really make sure that we weren't just gathering for the sake of gathering signatures, but that they were going to qualify us for this signature. What I would say about the paid, I mean, I would just say this is a tension that we hold within Washington Can, and within coalition, that I don't want to depend on getting bigger or having more capacity by hiring more staff. And at the same time, we want we want it to be recognized as a profession. And so that is like a tension that we hold. And I would say that as we've been gathering signatures for these other ballot initiatives from fellow panelists, it has not only have we had kind of the paid canvas, but we have infused more volunteers in that, recognizing that you're going to hit a ceiling very quickly, and that our goal should not to be let's have 60 organizers each, but really, what our movement needs is both those things. You need that like stability of like, okay, we have to get these hard numbers, and you can develop skill set and develop member leaders as well in the process.
And can you, both of you talked about validating signatures along the way. Can you just talk briefly about how you actually do that?
So we are members of Washington Community Alliance, who administers the van. And so as part of our membership there and paying for access to the van, we create a system where we have a data department of 1.5 people, and they, as part of their job, are validating signatures, going into van, doing quick lookup. And we also, while doing that, registered just shy of 800 newly registered voters for Federal Way who said, we want to register to vote so our signatures can help qualify this to be on the ballot. So it was like a system really technical where we would put a star next to their line if they were registered to vote on the petition. And then we knew if it was there, then they were going to be a newly registered vote and then turn those in. But it really is designating hours every day to go through, and I would say that's also part of data integrity when you're gathering signatures to ensure that they are legible, and like knowing when people kind of know that the system is to be able to read them afterwards, then the canvassers are much more like, oh, sorry, this needs to be legible. Can you do this again? So it was just kind of built into our weekly work, to validate signatures, but we had people that were designated to do that. And I still have those petition copies in my office because I just fear like, oh, this is still valid. Do not try to take this off. And I still got the box. It might be a footstool, but I still got it because I'm just terrified that we'll need it down the road because we were sued like 3 times over it. So yeah.
Yeah, which we'll talk about later. Tiffany or Katie, anything burning you want to add about signature gathering? I'll just say for Seattle, I think, for Seattle's context, a little bit different because we have so many big events where just lots of people congregate. And again, we do sometimes have the issue of a lot of out-of-towners, but there are, farmers markets and festivals where it's a great place to find people and people who are more our base. So our strategy for gathering signatures was more events than doors. But either of you want to add more?
Yeah, in Tequila and Burien, overwhelmingly we were doing door knocking. In Tequila, there was actually only one spot where it seemed productive to stand and gather signatures, and that was in front of the SARS market. And there, our validity rate was rock bottom because it did not matter how many times you told people they had to be a Tequila voter. They were in SeaTac, they're wherever. So yeah, overwhelming door knocking. And similarly in Burien, there were a few more places where we did like public space signature gathering, but still it was definitely mostly door knocking. which is
Yeah.
labor intensive. Yes.
Yeah, and I think just in general, the bigger the size of your municipality, the like more you can bank on those larger events. So Seattle's nice because your threshold that you have to collect is significantly smaller proportionate to the size of the city. So you have, like 600,000 people, but you only need to collect 40,000 signatures. Whereas in Renton, you literally have to collect in Burien, Renton, Tequila, you have to collect 15% of everyone who's registered to vote in that municipality, which means ultimately you're going to have to knock on some of their doors. And definitely we all had to do that, I think, in those ones.
And by the end in those code cities, you're just starting to get the sensation of like, we have found all of the people who are at home all the time. Like we have found the people who are out and about, and it's like it gets hard toward the end.
You know the neighborhoods very well by the end. Like we still remember turfs that had the spaghetti squash lady who gave us the 5 spaghetti squashes the day we did her neighborhood or something by the end of everything.
Just for the audience to know, yeah, in Seattle, it is based on the count of votes for the last mayoral election, so it's 10% of those. So it's been for both of our initiatives like 26,000 and some that we have to have valid. But as Mary and Fernando and others have mentioned, you always want to get like at least 10%, 20% or more above, because once this goes on to validation with King County elections, you want to make sure that you still are able to meet the signature threshold in order for your initiative to count. Whereas like, yeah, in Seattle, I actually would not recommend door knocking. High validity rate, but you don't need to, and it is so time consuming. Instead, go to all of the events that, as Fernando said, that we just have happening across our city all of the time. I will flag that we've probably now, if we do an initiative again, will not go to Folklife again. Even though you think that's one of the biggest events, it is the most tiring. You see the morale of everyone drop exponentially after Folklife. Can talk about that offline just with folks. If you're thinking about it.
I'll also add weather is just, such a huge driver. So we were trying to get on November ballot, but it's just so difficult, even with tons and tons of volunteers. There's just events don't start going until I guess May, summer. And so it's hard to collect a huge massive signatures until you see those events. And so that kind of can drive, the timing and what ballot you end up on. There's just no way around that. I know we talked a little bit about hiring paid signature gatherers already, and how you all approach that. Is there any other comments on that before I move on? Okay. And then any tips? Everyone has relied on a ton of volunteer work to collect signatures. So any tips on recruiting, training, and retaining signature gathering volunteers? Katie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing in Tequila, like we really wanted to kind of be building community as we were doing the initiative. And so every week, every Saturday, we had a gathering. We rented this space in the middle of the city, and we bought food from one of the small businesses that was a supporter of the campaign. And we had like volunteer activities in addition to signature gatherings. So we like made buttons, we made refrigerator magnets to give to people at the doors, and we like stuffed the folders for people to take out. And so we had people like volunteers doing stuff and eating food and hanging out. And then people would use that as a home base to go out and gather signatures. So I think that was like, it was fun. I mean, it was a lot, it was like work and everything, but it was like fun to have a more social aspect to it. And that I think probably helped people like want to come back and stick around. And so we had, a lot of really dedicated volunteers, like, traveling down from Seattle and then also folks from Tequila. And then definitely like leaned on all the organizations and the coalition to try to turn out for signature gathering days. I think it's important. One thing I think is important is to be realistic or modest about your expectations of to be realistic about your expectations for like coalition partners, because it's attractive to think like, oh, okay, we've got like 30 organizations that have endorsed this campaign and like they're all going to send tons of volunteers and we're just going to knock this out. But it's just a reality that like a lot of other organizations are most likely not as invested in this as you are, and they also are really busy with their own stuff and probably overwhelmed. So it's like maybe they'll turn a few people out for like a day or something like that. But like, don't expect that because you have a ton of organizations that say this is a good idea, that like that's going to carry your signature gathering effort.
Fernando, anything to add?
No, just echoing that with Katie. I think probably one of the most consistent partners that we had was definitely Transit Writers Union, and I hope we paid that back enough in our campaigns. But planning within your organization when you're thinking about how the size of something you want to tackle, about if you're going to have the coalition that you need to actually collect those signatures or the fundraising behind things to collect the signatures too. For us, it was really just, it ended up being a lot of digging deep with calling a lot of members that we have in DSA in Seattle, and trying to literally say, hey, look, the only way this is happening is if you individually book yourself on a weekly shift for the next few months. And then we were very fortunate to have probably a dozen members commit to actually bottom lining shifts regularly every week, and then a smattering of like another several score of members who would just come out and join them. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to make that campaign happen. And we got really fortunate with that.
Mary, I see your hand up.
I actually think that was because my hand was resting on my face. But the two things I would say
on Zoom.
to add, I know, is one is I think that the paid field canvassing works because it's a year-round canvas and we give opportunities for folks to come and stay on. And that's actually how we raise about 40% of our income is by dues paying members at the doors and activating them to call to action. The thing I would say about members volunteering is that to make it where they're successful. So there are folks that are super enthusiastic. They're like, I'm going to gather 10,000 signatures. And even if they gather 5,000, it looks like a disappointment. So what I would say is actually giving folks in packages of what if they say we can gather 10 signatures. Cool. Who are the 10 you're going to reach out to? And this is actually very similar to like union organizing, where you're like, I'm not going to give you these cards for the entire unit, but I'm going to give you how many you are going to reach out to, and then have them come in a couple days when they've been successful. Like, great, fill out this full sheet now. But I think giving people bite size so they experience the success of it, and that even if they're really successful but fall short of a goal, it could be really demoralizing. So that would be the other thing I would add.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like I think, like we've talked about how like the door knocking is so labor intensive. One tricky thing with volunteers is like there are going to be times when your volunteer goes away to do door knocking and they come back with like one signature, or like two signatures, or even sometimes no signatures, because it's just like you just had bad turf. It was, and so I think having a plan to like keep people's morale up. I mean, first of all, every signature counts, right? But you just have to expect that and make sure that you're like setting people's expectations, especially for the door knocking, appropriately, so they don't like feel disappointed because they didn't come back with 20 signatures.
Yeah, and I think even for us with populated events, it just takes so, even a page to fill 10 or 20, that just chips away slowly, but it takes so long to even gather that sometimes. And hear you on the demoralizing. We also tried to make sure to pair up new people with experienced folks their first time at least. So they had that guidance. Anything else, Tiffany, that you would add? Okay. All right, so that was signature gathering, huge part of the process. And then once you are done, you submit, it gets counted. And then there are a number of just little details and little steps that can be very confusing from that time to getting it on the ballot. So I'll let folks here talk about what they would flag to be aware of, whether it be from whether you need to gather extra signatures if you don't meet it, or the time it takes for different steps or transmission times. Tiffany, I'll start with you.
Yeah, through the Initiative 137/Prop 1A campaign, it became pretty clear to me and to the team that to get on the November ballot in Seattle is actually incredibly tricky time-wise. So first you have to like work back from November. You don't have up until like October or September to get onto the November ballot. It's actually the deadline, and I don't know if this is the same for code cities, but it is the primary. It is the primary, so it's that first Tuesday in August. So that is the day that the city council has to take action. In Seattle, that is pass it as is, put an alternative on the ballot, or just put it straight to the voters. So, and then you have to work back from that to also King County elections validating all the signatures and making sure that you meet the threshold to qualify for the ballot. And then the generous time that's also allotted to the city council to take up and to consider what they're going to do with their charter power. So you really have to work back from election day. And if you do it for Seattle, you're actually looking at needing to submit all of your signatures by like early April or mid-April. And I'm telling you that the weather is, you all know, horrific for gathering signatures between January and April. And all of the big events are not even happening until the summer. So if you do not have a favorable city council that is going to not delay the process like the city council did for our last one, and or just put it quickly onto the ballot once the signatures are validated, you do need to be prepared from the outset of gathering for a February election. And I do encourage you still to go forward with that because, again, all of us here have shown as well that February elections are really popular with regular people. So just want to say that at the top because it's not, you don't just get until like a couple weeks before November to put your initiative on the ballot. So it was working back from that. And then in Initiative 135, we were really, really desperate to get on the November ballot because, again, common wisdom, November ballot, that's the time to win, not any other ballot. But we turned in our signatures. We didn't have enough. Fortunately, in Seattle, you have a 20-day window in order to collect the remaining signatures in order to meet the validation rate that you need in order to be successful. Otherwise, you would just have to start from scratch again. So we are very nice to have this 20-day window where you can make up for the signatures that you don't have to qualify. We did use that for I-135. We did not use that for Prop 1A. Prop 1A, we turned in like 11,000 signatures more than we needed to in order to qualify for that. So to your other questions, though, what else to look out for? Yeah, in the city of Seattle, it is so nice to hear that Code Cities, the city council doesn't get to put their own their own something on the ballot. As you all probably remember, our city council took, I think it was 44 days. They have 45 days to act. They took up to 44 days to act on Initiative 137 before they put this alternative on the ballot. You all probably know, and or if you don't, it is pretty fun and funny to look back on. It wasn't at the time. The city council very much had the time to put Initiative 137 on the November ballot. They said that there were last minute legal issues that came up that prohibited them from being able to put it on the November ballot. But through public disclosure requests, which I don't think we talk about a lot here, but I do recommend everyone do, which when you do your own initiative is to PDR the heck out of your local legislative and executive branches. We learned that every city council member not only received the legal brief on our initiative 2.5 months before the deadline, but also that central staff walked around to every single city council office to schedule a meeting and or answer any questions that they had. So this idea that like Councilmember Kettle and others raised the like day before the deadline that, oh, new legal concerns is just patently false because we have the public disclosure request. So anyways, I'll get into that later for some like earned media when we're into getting out the vote, but just know how your city council can mess with you. Know the delays that can be implemented, know whether or not they can put on an alternative, and just always keep your base engaged, even though the validation period is long and nothing is happening. Have those appreciation events, have those networking and community building events, and then also turn them out to city council to encourage city council to act quickly. Just don't lose that base because you need that base in order to also win after you qualify for the ballot.
Thank you, Tiffany. Katie, anything else you would add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, for Code Cities, I believe the additional window for gathering is 10 days. Is that right, Fernando? So you remember?
I believe
instead
that's
of
right.
20. Yeah, so it's a shorter additional window. We also used that window in Burien. We actually turned signatures in knowing we didn't have enough just so that they would get the counting going and then turned in our supplemental batch, in time to make it to the February ballot this year. And I guess so, yeah, it's great that in code cities, the council can't put an alternative on the ballot, but they can fuck with you in other ways, as we learned in Burien. So they, so the first thing is that, so in Seattle, right, you have to file your initiative with the city before you gather signatures, and there's a process whereby the city drafts a ballot title, like which is what the voter is going to actually read on the ballot. And so then there's a process of if you don't like it, you can challenge it. All that happens before you gather signatures. In code cities, the ballot title thing happens after you turn them in. So, and it's the city attorney who drafts the ballot title. In Burien, the city attorney is, it's hard to think of an adjective, horrible. And we'll keep it clean. So he drafted a ballot title, which was and an explanatory statement for the voter pamphlet, which is supposed to be neutral. And they were just wildly like inaccurate and prejudicial. And we actually had to take the city to court. We had to like sue them before they backed down and agreed to a more neutral ballot title and explanatory statement that was more similar to Tukwila and Renton. The other thing that they did is I mentioned that they had passed legislation, kind of fake minimum wage legislation. Well, after our petition qualified for the ballot, they amended their legislation 3 times in the space of a month to make it look more like ours. So basically, they raised the wage rates for like a couple of the categories of employers so that they could say that they had already raised the minimum wage to the highest in the country, even though it still had all of these exemptions and loopholes, which meant that very few workers were going to get it. So they did this to basically introduce confusion so that voters thought, well, like the city already did this. Like, why do we have to vote on this? And then they like aggressively promoted this to people. So that like the city never does this, but they like sent out like postcards to like all residents being like, with a gold seal on it, being like, experience, highest minimum wage in the country. We did it. And they just like, yeah, they did all this kind of like misinformation, which was really skirting the line of like the city campaigning because they're not supposed to actually campaign. Yeah, so they can certainly do a lot to mess with you if they want to.
And I'll also add on that you should probably expect that from whatever city council that you're going up against. It happened in Renton as well, where we did public records requests in a lot of their emails. There was a lot of backdoor communication, backroom communication, just around trying to figure out ways they could either undermine our process or literally council members asking, what can we do to like stop this pretty much in effect when you read between the lines. Meetings that they held that were essentially an opportunity to beg the city attorney for a way to undercut the process that we were running. And then even, during the process, trying to strong arm the city attorney to invalidate more, or the city attorney and the city clerk actually to invalidate more of our signatures because of the dates and pushing. We actually had a fight with King County elections because the city of Renton was pushing King County elections to look at the dates that we had on our signatures differently than we'd anticipated, and also to throw out any signatures that weren't dated, even ones that were in a sheet of 10 where you have a valid date above and a valid date below, but they were saying the ones in the middle that forgot to put the date on it, we were going to try and throw those out. So we had to get into a few kind of back and forth legal battles with, I guess not official legal battles, but the kind where the lawyer writes the nice letter on the letterhead to tell them, no, you should count those signatures. And then even now, we're at the point where we're actually looking for minimum wage workers in Renton because the city's implementation of the legislation is actually not what we expected. They're actually stealing probably about $600 a year from minimum wage workers because of the way that they interpreted the inflation adjustments in the legislation, and they interpreted it differently than every other city with the same language. So right now, compared to Tukwila, compared to SeaTac, compared to essentially every other city, they're interpreting the inflation rates differently and stealing $600 a month from those minimum wage workers. And so we're at the point where we're trying to find workers who could be in a class action against the city in order to recoup some of their lost wages and set the policy straight. So even after you win it, there's still going to be layers of fighting that you might have to do to enforce it and make sure that the hostile city councils, the hostile city officials don't undercut it even further.
Thank you all. Such a wealth of knowledge there. I know each of those things can be a whole discussion, so feel free to follow up with us further. A couple people mentioned, knowing that city officials or staff were having certain conversations that was found out by, public disclosure requests. So you can request communications that occur among city staff and city officials. So that's how we went about. It does take a little while, but that can help with communications as well. All right, I'm going to move along to messaging. So, of course, messaging is important all through the process, from signature gathering to getting out the vote. So, Tiffany, can you talk about how you honed messaging, whether that changed over the course of the campaign?
Yeah, the great thing about the signature gathering process, one of the great things, it is, I think, I don't know if my fellow panelists agree, the most arduous part of the process. The GOTV, I think, is a lot more fun. But you have to gather the signatures in order to have the GOTV. So, one has to come before the other. But I'll say that for our messaging, it was always like from the ground up. When we were drafting for both initiatives, we were out there talking to voters about both initiatives. We're talking to them about their rent. How long is it gonna, how many more rent increases need to happen before you're priced out of the city and need to go elsewhere? And then during signature gathering too, because the opposition isn't taking you seriously, they're probably having conversations behind closed doors, but or doing polling, but they're not out there trying to stop you from gathering signatures. They're not in the press trying to get op-eds or trying to get the press right against it because they actually don't really believe that you're going to qualify for the ballot. I remember after we qualified for Prop 1A, talking to a Seattle Times reporter, it's like, oh man, we didn't think you were gonna make it. And I was like, how do you not like no one takes signature gathering on if you don't intend to win. But anyways, just people will the opposition, those in power will always like kind of write you off. And this is a beautiful moment to hone your message. You're talking to regular people, you're seeing what works and what doesn't, and you're conferring with other signature gatherers across the city in a weekly or bi-weekly field team meeting to discuss what's working well and what isn't. So that is the base. That's where you also have the time to create your talking points, to do your own opposition research, and just utilize all of that time before the actual yes versus no campaign becomes formalized. And then, it's just always your ear to the ground. Even during the Get Out the Vote campaign for Initiative 135, we did have opposition, and we had the Housing Development Consortium that opposed, and then also this older group of mostly white retirees. So what from there is actually permeating to the regular voter, the renter that doesn't know how they're going to be able to pay their rent if they get another rent increase, and then just tailoring that because you do have to change your talking points and your comm strategy in like those technical spheres, but regular voters don't really care about a lot of the hyper technical things that those in the media care about. So just always remembering that beauty. We ran all initiatives actually through a communications committee. So it's people from endorsing organizations, staff members, volunteers, community members join that committee, and we decide everything. We decide our entire comm strategy, our responses to opposition points, our main talking points. That is always fed into the field team as well, because it is those people talking to regular folks outside on the ground that also needs to feed our internal and external communication strategy. So it is an ongoing process. You do really get a head start, especially if you don't have the money for polling while you're signature gathering. But also both of our initiatives, it was focusing on like a positive and visionary, like what could Seattle look like if we actually invested in public goods in the public sector. So we always tried to anchor that way. But then, during Prop 1A, once you saw Amazon and Microsoft and others dumping hundreds of thousands of dollars like it was nothing, we had a lot of fun also pushing back on that as well and tying these tech billionaires to the Trump administration.
Yeah, the point about involving just work groups of our volunteers is super important. I don't think anyone here used consultants, right, for their campaigns. Yeah, we all kind of did it within our coalition and our members, and did not spend money on that. Mary, do you want to add anything about messaging?
Yeah, we purposely did not do any polling. One, because we didn't have the money, and two, we were just like, can we get some political consultants out of this game? Because you're making money. Like, I don't want to buy your second home. Like, I'm here to like invest this back into reorganizing, and continue to organize going forward. So I would say that like because we were a small coalition, it was like mostly Washington Can and a couple of other folks from Tenants Union and a couple of different labor unions, we were able to do what Tiffany said much more seamlessly. What we heard at the doors were like, oh, people actually are not connecting to being called tenants in Federal Way. Let's call them renters. Big issue was safety. How do we then incorporate safety into the messaging, when it's like, well, if you don't evict people every other week, you actually have a pretty stable neighborhood. And that's actually how you create safety, is that I know this red truck doesn't get parked in Tiffany's driveway. Like, you don't have a red truck. I'm going to text you and say, is that you or someone you know? I'd also say we shifted halfway through because we went to a conference that the Progress Alliance put on that had somebody talking about the race class narrative. And they had this session where it's like, stump the chump and ask us about your campaign and we'll help you message it. So Sochi is like elbowing people to get her hand up, and then is like on stage asking, here's our messaging, and said, "Ooh, here's how I would shift it." And by 3 days later, we were shifting our messaging where we started talking about a landlord code of conduct. We were not vilifying all landlords like we had before, because as many of you know, Washington has oftentimes has a burn it down mentality. And so we're like, all landlords are greedy. And it was just like, no, use this messaging to like say there are a few greedy landlords that are telling most of people where they should be living and how and what it should cost. So I think just honing in, naming race as an issue, and that regardless of race, class, what zip code we want people to be thinking about, like, we don't want kids to be worrying about where they're going to sleep at night. We just want them worrying about homework, not whether they have a home. So like really kind of understanding different niches and then seeing who would be trusted messengers. So we specifically sent white organizers to the places that had really high property values and really pretty views, and just starting to target who would be helpful messengers for that. And then I would also say that the voter guide was not something that we knew we had to even do. Like, we just get a voter guide that's sent to us, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is actually an opportunity to enforce our narrative, to dispute the opposition's narrative. But it is a really funky, odd turnaround and timeline of when you need to submit, when you have to have a rebuttal statement, how many words it can be. Like, those are technical things that you don't learn until you're scrambling to get it done in the deadline they tell you. So that's just another thing to think about when you're running initiative.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Mary. I'm gonna move us along. If you all have any other comments about messaging, please put them in the chat. Because I do want to get to Q&A. So in our next question, if you all, let's start with Fernando, but can you talk about the voter outreach methods we'll go around to everybody. So talking about voter outreach methods during getting out the vote, and also any strategies for getting media coverage. I'll start with you, Fernando.
Yeah, good question. So for voter outreach, by the time we'd gotten to GOTV for Get Out the Vote, to get our really well-known people on board, making sure they had their voting plan and everything, we'd already done a lot of door knocking in Renton. At that point, we'd gone to pretty much every neighborhood. We knew where our supporters were. We knew where the good turfs were. We had our kind of distribution of people who'd already signed, and we used that to help target our outreach, because we had a lot of good data around that. So that was one really primary driver in terms of where we sent people to remind people to vote. And then in addition to just doing the field door knocking targeting, we also had a decent number of phone numbers at that point of people who'd signed up for information from us. And we used that as well, where we had, a hot list of people who had signed and put their numbers down and let us follow up with them about the campaign, reminded them that, hey, the vote's coming up. We actually need you to remember for this, and did some follow up that way as well. So those were a lot of the GOTV outreach pieces. In terms of media, I think we had kind of mixed success in getting some pieces around Raise the Wage Renton. We definitely had some mentions. I don't really think we did as well as I think we could have for future campaigns to get like a more of a media presence. Also, just because I think the advantage you have in Seattle is some more well-known publications and reporters who are pretty left-leaning, whereas in Renton we had kind of more traditional media sources, which definitely gave us, I think, fair mentions, but it was harder to get the kind of like bombastic like news coverage that we might want to contrast what we thought was happening with a lot of establishment Chamber of Commerce very business friendly candidates who are really pushing against this as hard as they could. But definitely getting to know the people who we were talking with every day was big. We also had a pretty intentional effort around a lot of communities who spoke different languages. So we had an entire, I'd say 80% Ukrainian community that we targeted with Ukrainian speaker. It was probably 80% Ukrainian and then 20%, 10, 15% other languages. So doing as much outreach as we could to a lot of the international communities when we had the ability to do languages that they actually spoke was really impactful, I think, too. But just getting to know those turfs as well as we could from the people who'd already gone out there so much was massive.
Mary, anything to add to GOTV or media?
We did, well, when op-eds were easier to get placed, we did a few of those. And it was helpful from not only former elected officials in Federal Way, but also from small landlords. So I think that was really helpful in making us seem more reasonable. In terms of our GOTV, we did a couple of different targets. Obviously, like we love our door knock, so that was our favorite method and targeted New American Majority. And then I would say we also had gotten a list by accident. So this cannot be replicated probably, but we got information from over 600 voters who specifically requested in language ballots. And so we targeted them. The majority were Vietnamese and Spanish speakers. And so we got elders in the community to write letters. About why they came to this country and why housing is not an easy dream for everybody the way that we thought it would be when we came to this country. So we sent those specific handwritten letters that were like copied and chose specifically elders in the community, especially on the Vietnamese side, and mailed those directly. And then I would say we also partnered with an indivisible group who wrote postcards to all of the newly registered folks who said, welcome to the ballots, knowing with like cute stickers. And so I think they got a lot of touches that were untraditional, like unconventional ways of being reached out to. They were not shiny postcards that were thick that you're like, "Woo, this campaign got a lot of money." It was like, photocopied shit with like black and white, hand addressed. But they definitely were opened.
Much cheaper than mailers. I do want to move on to Q&A. So Tiffany or Katie, anything else burning to add about GOTV or media?
Only thing I'll add is just, because focusing on housing, focusing on renters, if you were to go the traditional consultant route, they would tell you to really skip those voters, focus on people that vote, focus on people that are high propensity voters. But actually, this was even an astonishing number to me for our Prop 1A door knocking. I think it was between 40 and 60% of the people that we door knocked didn't vote in the last special election. They voted, however, in the one before that for I-135. So just know where your base is. Don't shy away from focusing on them because they will turn out for you if you're giving them something that they want to turn out for.
Katie, anything?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that I think a general rule for like media coverage and reporters is the more work you can do for them, the more likely they're going to cover your story. And so I think like in Tequila, like I mentioned, we did a ton of outreach to workers at South Center Mall. And so we were able to hook up like Seattle Times reporters with like people to interview. And that I think was really effective at getting us some good news stories.
All right, I know we covered a lot, a lot of information, and a lot more we didn't get to, but I wanted to leave time for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom, put in the chat if that works better for you. And we're excited to hear what you got. Mia.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for this. Sorry to be off camera. I'm just like in a noisy coffee shop, but um this was super inspiring and I was just curious if you guys like this isn't directed to anyone in particular, but could talk more about like I guess like the voter receptiveness to some of these initiatives across geographic regions. So like if there were differences between maybe like how friendly people were to the idea in Seattle proper versus like more outside. Sorry, there's background noise. But yeah, or just more generally about like what was more like you guys talked about the messaging, but just in terms of yeah, whether like receptiveness to the initiative itself varied based on where you were or where you went.
I can say something about that. I mean, I think that outside of Seattle, like in Seattle, like, they got a tax initiative passed. It would be really interesting to know how like a tax the rich kind of thing would do in a South King County city. But in general, I would say that like minimum wage and renter protections, because they're not taxes, they're a little easier for outside of Seattle. There tends to be just like the kind of like anti-tax narratives tend to have more hold. And in Tukwila, the minimum wage was just like super popular. We didn't have opposition, but we won with 83% of the vote, which was like just amazing. And so I think like Burien was a little more like Renton, where there was a little more opposition at the doors and stuff like that. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I see it more on neighborhood by neighborhood basis than cities overall. Like, I could compare Kennydale and Renton to like Magnolia and Seattle, and you get, depending on who you're knocking the doors of in those different neighborhoods, you're going to get similar responses. Whereas if I'm knocking in, the Renton Highlands, I'm going to get a mix. If I'm knocking in Fremont and Seattle, I'm going to get a mix. And I think a big thing is just trying, whenever you're doing any of those campaigns, like thinking about where your effort's going to be most valuable for the initiative that you're trying to pass. So, in Renton, we knew to look at anywhere we thought there would be higher renter densities because they're probably also going to be, workers who are going to agree more with the policies that we're pushing for higher wages. And I think you see that across all the campaigns that I've, been able to door knock for, signature gather for, is that like trying to figure out where the people are who are going to really support what you're doing and trying to connect with them as much as possible. And I think especially in Washington, especially in South King County, South Seattle, at least doing a bare minimum effort to try and learn a few of the basic phrases for the languages of the people you're going to talk to was like really helpful for me. Like I had, even if you just learn like hello, like my name is, and you get Google Translate out, like I've gotten dozens of signatures from just being able to say that at the very beginning in like a few different languages. And um, the Vietnamese mom who's pretending she doesn't speak English will eventually just be like, all right, my English is better than your Vietnamese and your French. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's right. We can talk. So just doing your best to try and connect with any of those communities who might be willing to support you if you make that effort, I think is just a really big piece, more so than um, having it be city by city based.
I'd also say for folks
Go,
that are
Mary.
putting in the effort for city council first, trying to pass it there, that also like widely, like Seattle, you have to pack the room with matching t-shirts in order for them to even notice you anymore. But like in Federal Way, we started with like 10 to 15 people with matching, and they were like, oh, this is super like holy shit, we're not used to this. So I think it depends on which city you're in, where how heavy you can make those efforts. And what I would say too is that those city councils are tend to be less risk adverse. So if there are things that have passed in Seattle, that has been super helpful because they have a more, their city attorney is more used to defending these types of initiatives from passing. And so having those, having that domino effect makes the smaller, less resource cities less risk adverse to take on your initiative.
The only thing that I would add is that I think regardless of where you are, even if you're in Yakima or Spokane or Kennewick, if you are putting forward something that will make a material difference to people's lives, they will get excited about it and they will want to be involved. I say that 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and I say that's even more present now, given that the entire gutting of our system as we know it is taking place under the Trump regime. And we have, unfortunately, Democrats at the state level that are not stepping up to tax the wealthiest to make sure that our social services, our education services, our infrastructure is not cut. I mean, we have barely seen the beginning of what is coming down on us. So I think that people look to their electeds to solve their problems, but I think overwhelmingly our electeds are not doing that. And the initiative is a great way to get people excited about things and not have them feel it's a fringe thing. Like, oh, I could have my minimum wage be 21 or $22. That's not fringe, or that's not too radical, or I could have housing that's actually for people and not for profit, not for, as Mary said rightly earlier, like someone's second house or whatnot. Like, that's so strange, but I'm gonna have hope in this. Like, I think people have still want to have a lot of hope. They need to have more hope now than ever. And initiatives and putting forward material policies are a really great way to tap into folks that have maybe become disenfranchised with the system because they get excited about electeds, they get excited about candidates, but then when those candidates take office, overwhelmingly, they disappoint, whereas issues do not have that same track record.
Thanks, Mia. I see a question in the chat about collection of resources. Fernando is going to follow up, but also if any panelists here have any resources they put together, you can send to me and I can share with everyone afterwards. I know we have, Tiffany, you've put together a comms strategy presentation. I don't know if that's something we can share, but also we have like our public media or social media toolkits that we sent to folks when we were getting out the vote, so we can share that. But I'm happy to collect anything that's shareable.
Yeah, and we also we did this for Everett, and we also have people who did an initiative down in Tacoma for Tacoma for All, and Everett did another minimum wage initiative. So if there's anybody out there who's in a city that they're interested about the process and want to learn more, like we've sent people to have conversations in other cities to try and get people ready for a process that they might want to undertake. So my email's in the chat if you want to reach out. We're more than happy to have our electoral working group talk to you about what that looks like and plan out what it could be in your municipality or get you involved in other efforts. So
The Howard just has a comment that Seattle, the last 40 years, initiatives that were serious enough to have a formal signature gathering effort, 9 of 10 initiatives were passed with only 1 loss, with the reasonable city council alternative winning instead. So yes, when you put in the work, it has, more often than not paid off. Any other questions? I'll put our House Our Neighbors email in the chat as well. Any other questions before we adjourn?
I really just appreciate you all putting the panel together, because we've been like generous on the side with one another when we're like learning to run these initiatives, right? Which is like, here's a report that I never published, that says a lot of things because the pandemic happened. Oh yes, Katie, the font on an initiative has to be this size. Let me dig through my emails. So I think we've been generous on this side with one another, and so appreciate this format because I don't want to hold, like, we don't need to be holding it all. We can share and be generative, and just, yeah, like, let's just run things.
Thank you. I learned so much too from this. Just the plug, we are doing an in-person version of this at El Centro de la Raza on Tuesday at 5 p.m. for those of you who are in Seattle. We will also have campaign materials that we've saved on site to, if you want to look at that branding and messaging and what we produced, that's also going to be available at the in-person event. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing the wealth of knowledge. I will follow up with recording and extra materials, and really appreciate you spending part of your Sunday with us. Thank you all.